Welcome back to another episode of Liminal Frames. I'm your co-host Nathan, and I'm joined with my good friend Darren, ExoAcademian. Darren, it's been a while. We've done 12 episodes of the show and took a little bit of a break for the summer, which was really great. And it's not that we did nothing. We kind of worked on some other projects, some collaboratively and otherwise. But it's nice to really kind of get back in the chair and pick up the show again and take it forward, particularly with a lot of the things that are going on in the community. But before we kind of jump into that, I just wanted to check in with you. How you doing, and what's going on with you right now?
I'm doing great, thanks. And yeah, it was been a great summer for numerous reasons, writing and research, and fall for me, especially beginning of September has always kind of been, ever since, we were in school as kids, has kind of been this chiming into a new season of life that comes around every year where, you really dig in and research. And so that fits right in with this ongoing topic that we're interested in with the UFO phenomenon and general paranormality. So as the leaves begin to fall, as they do here in the Blue Ridge Mountains, I'm always ready to really dig in, and it just feels a little bit different than the summer vibe. But yeah, a lot has happened since we last recorded an episode, which was only a few months ago, amazingly.
Yeah, it feels like ages ago. And I love the fact that you brought up the seasons, because I do think that's a good sort of way to kick off this episode. And that's really thinking about the seasons of change that we all go through, both just throughout the year, but in a community of interest, in a topic that we're all invested in one way or another. We also go through seasons of change. And just to kind of think about where we are right now in this topic, kind of where we've come from, where we might be going, there's a lot to reflect on. And if we can kind of set the table a little bit for the state of the nation, if you will, in ufology or in phenomenological studies, there's a lot that has happened. There have been some hearings. There's additional language that seems to be moving through Congress that could provide some significant protections to whistleblowers who may want to come forward and reveal what they know about black budget programs or historical government involvement with the UFO topic. That certainly seems like it's gaining a lot of momentum. We've got additional kind of movies coming out. I know one in particular from James Fox that's on the way, Moment of Contact, about a case in Virginia, Brazil. I'm sure there's a lot of interest around that. We have, of course, a lot of folks continuing to do research. Particularly, we've seen some emergence of the application of AI into researching historical record of this topic, both of individuals who have played a role in quote unquote the cover up, or have been involved with things like the Disclosure Project, and and we're looking back and kind of verifying whether or not they in fact were who they said they were. And it's interesting to me, at least, to kind of see these new vectors of analysis applied to a topic that has been active for so very long. And then on top of all that, kind of momentum, which I think if we were to take stock, everything that has happened right now and look back, say 5 years, we would be really amazed at kind of where we are. But on top of that, forward progress that I think is true, we also have a lot of sort of infighting and kind of drama. There's some factionality that seems to be emerging, and none of that is new. I think that's important to kind of mention as well, that drama is kind of always a part of this topic, and it has been forever. There's a lot of folks that are heavily invested in it, both personally, financially, and otherwise. And anytime you've got that level of investment, you're going to have some sort of heated exchange from time to time. But before we kind of start unpacking all of that and going into some of that detail, I also wanted to sort of remind our listeners, those who have been with us since the beginning of the year through the 12 episodes that we've already done, and those of us who might be joining us for the first time right now, I wanted to sort of remind folks kind of what one of the missions or purposes of Liminal Frames happens to be. And I think one of the things that we excel at is being able to sort of have a nuanced level-headed conversation about the topic more broadly. What we want to be able to do is take a lot of different tools, look at these issues and topics of interest from many different angles, and as we turn them over and examine them from those different facets, the idea, the hope is that by doing that, we provide folks with a better ability to kind of think through the implications of these things, to not look at them from a purely one-dimensional level. Because if there's anything that we have learned in our own journeys with this, the multi-dimensional approach to this topic has served us very, very well. Because there's a lot of uncertainty, there's a lot of unknowns in this area, and so to keep an open mind about what all the different possibilities might be is serves us very, very well. As more facts come out, we can kind of then pivot and think about those facts in new ways. But Exo, I didn't know if you want to touch on any of that, both kind of where we are and also just like what we're trying to do with liminal frames.
Yeah, some great opening points there. I would just highlight what you said there in terms of a major impetus for us even beginning this show, because Lord knows there's plenty of UFO shows out there, with podcasts and YouTube channels. But what we kind of noticed was missing from the conversation, which is kind of a secondary matter. It's more that we did this because this is what we feel called to, and it fits both of our personalities. But we've, been involved in the past in looking at topics with a very overarching perspective, with a view that tries to take in multiple viewpoints. Multi-perspectival is the word that I use for that, which is basically saying, and you've seen these famous analogies where you have a certain shape, and depending where you're standing, the shape will literally look different. It could be a circle, it could be a cylinder, it could be a rectangle. And the point of those is to demonstrate to people that, hardline truth is kind of the wrong way to look at it, that something can be simultaneously multiple things depending on your viewpoint. And, a more full perspective takes into consideration all of those different vantage points. So that's really key, because especially in this topic, which, it's interesting. When we first started, I remember seeing someone comment that, well, you guys will probably hit all the major topics in about 10 episodes and you'll have nothing more to talk about. And I thought, au contraire, not only is there constantly new things happening, as we said, so much has happened since we last recorded a show, which was only, maybe back in June or something. But there's so many different angles at which you can approach this topic, because it ultimately ends up pointing towards the very nature of reality itself. That's, and we'll get into later on how ufology gets flares up into these different drama points around things like woo, or what some people would consider woo, right? Because that in itself is kind of a pejorative term for a lot of people. But it's there's so much involved, and you can't study this topic for very long before you inevitably end up asking the biggest questions. Why are we here? How did we get here? Who put us here? Where is this all going? How much are we being ongoingly interacted with? And the very nature by which these others interact with us is so otherworldly that you don't just say, do they just have a more advanced view of physics than we do? But perhaps is the construct by which we base all of our understanding of what reality is perhaps open to question. And that's where we ultimately land. So whenever we talk about the state of the nation with this topic, we're just giving you a glimpse here of how much you have to open the aperture, how much you have to really take into consideration so many different factors. And that's why, like I said, I think in one of the first couple episodes, you could do 500 episodes of liminal frames and still not even, crack the surface, really.
Absolutely. And, I think it's interesting too that a lot of folks might bemoan the fact that there are so many different ways to look at this topic, that there are so many different theories, hypotheses, that some might look at that and say, see, it's a low information zone and everyone's just kind of throwing stuff out there. And there's nothing that we can look at as a sort of consensus of opinion. And therefore, with no consensus opinion, it's not really a topic that is worthy of study. And I would push back on that to say there are many things in our culture that don't have consensus opinion. And in fact, there are many scientific disciplines and academic disciplines whose very, kind of purpose is to look at the same kind of phenomena in human life, whether that be biology or human behavior, economics. You can insert a lot of different topics here: religion, philosophy. We have entire departments and disciplines and universities devoted to the study of these things. And the chief goal among them is to look at these areas of interest from different perspectives and try to find something that has a high level of meaning, that of sort of narrative veracity, that becomes something that is useful in a way to understand what these things are. And that's essentially what we're trying to do as well, and what the community of interest is trying to do as well. And that is to, kind of look at this issue from a lot of different facets, a lot of different experiences, a lot of different disciplines applied to different kind of lenses, if you will. And in doing so, hopefully try to find certain narratives that emerge that have great explanatory power. And I don't know if you want to touch on that. To me, that's just something that just feels natural, and I'm totally comfortable with that. It doesn't bother me at all. But for others, I see there's a lot of pushback that there's just too much out there, and therefore it's not worth study at all.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think again for you and I, we've discussed this before on this show that we've been through several iterations where we adopted completely different worldviews, and to be clear to people just how much that entails. When you adopt a new worldview, it's not just about seeing the same things differently. It's literally about seeing different things. That the reality you construct around you is partly determined by your worldview. And while that may sound ridiculous to some people, there's mounting evidence pointing in this, both just in neuroscience and evolutionary game theory and physics. It's very clear that we initially take in some information and then we form these kind of cache pockets or these memories that we use to primarily re-represent reality as it has been to us previously. And so I've been reading a great book by Ian McGilchrist on this topic, that in order to save memory, basically working memory, what our brains do is pull up information relevant to what we're experiencing now. And unless there's something really startlingly different, it'll just re-represent what we already have seen and experienced. And that happens all the time. Of course, this is happening immediately. And so we lose self-awareness around the fact that this is what's really going on. But I'm sitting in my office right now, which I've sat in it every day pretty much, mostly over the last several years. And so my mind can just sort of fill in the gaps with cached memory of what this office looks like, rather than allocating resources to representing it, right, in real time. So that is so key. I would also add, finally, to your point, that I remember coming across this one person that really, really was into quantum theory. And their point was, this is my view of how the phenomenon fits in with quantum theory, and science is pretty much 100% on board that this is mainstream science now, so we're good to go. And I kind of picked up from that they were thinking that from here on out, everybody believes that quantum theory is the final standard for reality. What they don't realize is that, like you pointed to, there's this constant flux going on actually between, just like you have with certain industries, where you'll have like a mature industry, then you'll have a declining industry, then you have a new disruptive industry that comes in, or a company that can disrupt a previous industry. In the same way in science, as Thomas Kuhn pointed out, we go through scientific revolutions. That's how we've actually progressed. And notice that word, revolution. It's not just evolution. It's not just iteration. It's not just fine tuning. It's literally tearing up the floorboards and starting again. So it was not that long ago, about 100 years ago, that we had the revelation and the revolution of quantum mechanics. That's not all that long ago. Much of mainstream science still has not come to terms with what that actually means for reality. But we would be foolish to the nth degree to assume that's the last of those kind of revolutions we'll go through. And in fact, most recent science in terms of physics is pointing towards this deeper structure that makes space-time itself and quantum theory look like a projection that emerges from some deeper structure. So yes, we are still in the midst of this. And I would just say to people, try to learn to be comfortable with that discomfort. Try to move away from relying on stasis to feel like your world is worth living in. I mean, I think that this is just the adventure. We keep saying this. I keep saying this, right? That try to approach it more like an adventure where we're discovering new things every day, just like kids do. And they don't get overwhelmed by the fact that there's plenty they don't know. At some point, we trade off that for certitude, right? We want that feeling of certitude. And I would say, let's just return to that kind of childlike nature of awe and wonder.
Great point. Great point. And it's funny too, because like, as you pointed out, the sort of competition of ideas, this friction between competing theories, this lends to our progress. And that's something that is just a fact, and that's been a fact of human civilization since we've been doing things. And so it's funny to me that that's the way things work, yet we still have a lot of drama that we kind of fixate on, and we kind of confuse the drama, the sort of level of investment we have in a particular worldview and idea. We confuse the importance of that versus the kind of the process itself. And so, that might be a good segue into kind of talking a little bit about the drama that we've seen in the community of interest recently. And some of that, or much of that, stems from this heavy investment in specific ideas constituting what the phenomenon, what it, quote unquote, actually is. So we have a lot of sort of tribalism or high degree of investment in certain specific ideas and what's at play here. And folks kind of put themselves in those camps and defend those ideas very vigorously against anything that kind of comes against that particular notion. And that's not something that is abnormal. I mean, humans are going to do that. They're going to argue a point, particularly if they find it to be very convincing. But it's one thing to kind of argue a position on its merits, and it's another thing to kind of take those arguments to the level of personal attack, to kind of the low road, being very vitriolic and toxic in the way that we kind of go to bat for these positions. And so I don't know, what are your thoughts on what we've seen, particularly recently, with some of the kind of little Twitter spats or personality wars that we've kind of seen pop up. I mean, I know that's nothing new within ufology or really human history at all, but how do you look at that, and what are some good sort of takeaways to think about if we want to kind of look at that in a better light?
Yeah, that's a great question, and a big one to tackle. I would begin by saying that some people, rather than opting for contemplating and considering different ideas or different notions, different hypotheses, what they end up doing instead is aligning with certain individuals, right? Certain people. And therefore, even if those people that they are aligning with or putting all their trust and hopes in, if those people that are these sort of figureheads change their perspective or evolve, sometimes the people who are following them will just not even acknowledge that there's been a shift. So when people might come in, well-meaning people might come in and say, well, it's interesting because this figurehead, I'm just using that word creatively, used to say this, but now they're saying this. That's kind of a change. And some people that, again, support that figurehead and put all their hopes in that figurehead's being right, they will actually try to defend this person, what they think is defending, by saying, oh, no, there's been no shift, And it reminds me of when one time, you and I both come from this Christian background and church history and understanding all of that. I remember one time this church I was involved in Houston back in the day. They had this open session where people from the community could come and ask questions about the Bible and about Christianity. And this one woman got up and was very thoughtful and said, well, what do you make sense of the sort of different depiction of God in the Old Testament versus the New Testament? The New Testament seems much more caring, open-hearted, welcoming, much more condemning and rule-centered in the Old Testament. And the response of this one pastor, which was a friend of mine, was to deny that there was any difference, right? He basically just shot down her points and said, "You're wrong. Next," you know? And that was not helpful. And it not only was it not helpful, but people are smarter than that. Most people are smarter than that. They'll recognize that you're just deflecting and denying an issue rather than actually addressing it. So that's the first thing, is to say that we need to be open, that if even people that we put a lot of faith and trust in, if they shift position, it's okay to acknowledge that, and I think we look more open-minded to the data when we do that. But to that point further, people tend to often lump people into either the hero or the villain category, right? So I have to admit, even for myself, if there's one way that I'm susceptible to this, it's in the villains, right? So a Mick West is often a challenge for me. Even though, as you and I have talked about privately, he's doing the best he can based on where he's at and his current worldview. His current worldview is more closed than he is self-aware of. And it determines what he even will consider as data, or even possibilities of where that data could lead. But nevertheless, he's still doing the best he can based on where he is. It does no good to paint him only as a villain, like he's Darth Vader to the community, and we all have to, try to take up arms against the Empire, right? He is a human being with a worldview, moving along a spectrum like all of us. On the flip side, there are people that others consider heroes, and they will defend them to the nth degree, which ultimately is not even helpful for those people that are those figureheads, because we all make mistakes. We all have a shift in perspective. I'll be the first to admit my perspective on this phenomenon has shifted numerous times and will change yet, I guarantee you. So I don't need someone defending me by saying to somebody else who's a critic necessarily, "Oh, well, Exo used to say this and now he's saying this." I'll be the first to admit there has been some shift. And I think if we're diligently engaging with this phenomenon, to use a phrase from our friend James Iandoli, then that should be the fruit of that endeavor. So I would just say to people, try to be more self-aware about this heroing and villaining of the entire process, and try to be a bit more nuanced about the actual arguments behind those people, that it doesn't ultimately serve any of us to put people into those two camps and just leave it there.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. I think it really is. It does no one any favors. Particularly those folks that are, kind of pushing hardest on this, for us to, kind of lionize them in the way that we often do. It's not to diminish the contributions that they are making, and every movement has its heroes, its proponents, those that are making a significant difference in where things are going. But to, kind of take a position that essentially what we're talking about is robbing that person of their humanity. We are taking that away from them. Their right to be a complex person with different viewpoints, evolving viewpoints, personality flaws, things that they're really good at as well. We're kind of robbing them of all of those things and instead flattening them into a very one-dimensional figure. And, believe it or not, that has an impact on the individual. There is an absolute effect when you, and this happens, I think, in any, kind of collection of people, where if enough people formulate an idea of a person and propagate that idea very vigorously, that picture of the individual does in some ways begin to be adopted by that person on a personal level. And that, again, does them a tremendous amount of harm, and really gets in the way of, at least in my opinion, it gets in the way of what the overall sort of objective of that group happens to be. And so you see this time and time again, sort of leaders who recognize when this is happening. If they're cognizant of it, what they will try to do is kind of extricate themselves from the situation. They'll try to, diminish the role that they have played, because at some point their sort of conception of who they are is getting in the way of what the objective happens to be. So either see that happen, or what you'll often see happen, maybe more often see happen, is the leaders themselves will have an incredible falling out. They will basically kind of crash and burn in a very public fashion. And if that happens, it can do a tremendous amount of harm to the community, and to kind of at least from an outsider's perspective, because those who may not be as familiar with kind of the ins and outs of the topic, and the intricacies of the community, that have kind of been working through these issues, they're just looking at this from the outside and saying, oh, look at so and so and how terrible of a person they are, and because they're terrible, nothing that they have said or done is worthy of interest. It has no validity. The entire thing that they stood for is therefore just completely worthless. And I think that, just think about the harm that does, both to the objective of the community, but also to those individuals themselves. And so, in short, what I would argue for is to really bring back into our conversation the human element, to sort of try to guard against this tendency that we have to one-dimensionalize people, to remove their complexity, and just rob them of the ability to have kind of a nuanced conversation and change over time.
Yeah, absolutely. Some great points in there. A couple things that I want to build on a bit. I really liked your point about, true leaders will do their best to extricate themselves from the process at some point. And there's this expression that the best leaders in the end work themselves out of a job. That they pass it on for everyone else to be able to pick up the torch and carry it on. Even think about historical figures like Jesus of Nazareth, for instance, right? Would say things like, "You will do even greater things than these," right? And again, what's ironic is that it's that we as a civilization, we as groups of people tend to really default to making heroes of these figures that began certain movements. And you and I have discussed before this notion I came across of man, myth, monument, right? Being these three-step process we go through where first it's a human being, of course, man or woman. Then there's a sort of mythos that builds up around that person the further we get from when they actually lived, right? Especially in oral traditions, right? Where we've talked a lot about religious history, for instance. And you have a long oral tradition, often before things were ever written down. And we all know how the game of telephone goes, and things can change over time, right? So then you've got a myth built up around the person that might have already shifted a fair amount from what they actually said and did. And then eventually you have a monument phase where you try to lock it down and say, this is what the person said. These are the immutable laws, therefore, right, around these religious figures. And it can't change. Now it's tame and it's safe, right? And so you have the ironic process where people who actually wanted to free people to embark on an adventure, for instance, spiritually, like I would say that Jesus actually meant to do. Instead, what you have people doing is locking down, saying, let's ascribe all of these divine characteristics to this individual. Let's make them as much dislike us as possible, right? They really are like, does his feet even touch the ground technically, or did he just float around like a gray alien, right? So there's that process, right? And you could argue in the end, you end up with something that's very, very different in religious tradition than what was originally meant. And what's interesting about this, speaking of bias, is that you can actually, when you look at it with a certain perspective, you can see this in the biblical text, in the Gospels, for instance. You can see that this was his aim. And yet another group of people, say coming from a more fundamentalist perspective, can read those very same texts and not see it. That's my point about touching back to worldviews. that you can read the same text, two different people, and come away with different conclusions, right? And we should also remember that with this phenomenon, where getting clear data is hard enough as it is. But once we've gotten the data, you're still going to have people that draw different conclusions, a la McWest, right? Based on the very same data. And to your point about these hero figures, right? They can be, again, we're multidimensional beings, and somebody can be really soar in one area and actually be lacking some self-awareness and be kind of underdeveloped in other areas. And part of my integral background was recognizing that actually there's multiple intelligences to every human being. And you can be a guru in one area, have broken through to some really deep levels of understanding the nuances of reality beyond the physical structure of the waking world, and still need therapy. You know what I mean? I read an article recently that was something like that. The title was something like, I think our guru needs therapy. You can be both. You can be someone who has deep insights, penetrating insights into the nature of spiritual reality, and still be lacking self-awareness in other areas, because again, there's these multiple intelligences. And we flatten a complex structure when we try to assume people are just one-dimensional that way, which again, like we said, ultimately doesn't help any of them. The last point I would make too around this drama piece is that, like you pointed out, some people have favorite hypotheses going in. For instance, some people coming in with more of a nuts and bolts perspective, right? That either these are ET craft coming in from Zeta Reticuli, or it's nothing at all, right? Or just black budget projects, right? US military and whatnot. And when data begins to present more and more what they would call woo, right? More and more high strangeness, general paranormality co-arising with these sightings, they will, again, sometimes without being self-aware, say, I'm switching sides. I'm just going to say this is all black budget tech because I refuse to believe that stuff is real. So if you're going to make me consider that with these sightings, I would rather just say the whole thing is hogwash, or the whole thing is just misidentifications of military craft. And that can happen without that person even being self-aware of that process. And they end up switching sides, become skeptics, cynics because of this. And this is why this topic is so complex. And we really, again, we hit on this over and over again. Trying to develop self-awareness is so important because of these issues.
Yeah, and something we've talked about often as well is this sort of the energetic tendencies that people have, and I would say not only as individuals but as sort of as groups. So, the energy that people bring to a conversation, to a topic, or whatever, over time that they get to know them, it becomes kind of obvious what that energy happens to be. It can be incredibly intense. It can be, quite flippant. It can be everything in between, nonchalant. So there's a spectrum of I think behavior, related to this topic in particular. And the way I kind of look at that is that I've come to this place where it's less sort of my responsibility to, kind of bring someone, like actively try to bring someone over to my particular vantage point. Instead, what I've decided to do is really just, kind of be, the best that I can be in how I'm expressing my own energetic tendency toward this issue. And there are going to be those that are like-minded or feel kind of a gravitational pull to that, and then there are those that are not, and that's okay. So in other words, that we have to kind of make space, in my opinion, for the broad spectrum of interest or disinterest in this topic. Because at the end of the day, we are kind of a human family, and as families tend to do, there's there are some who behave one way and other ways, and you get them all together for Thanksgiving, and sometimes it's not the most pleasant experience, but you can still have a meal together, and they're still part of your family, and you can still go to bat for them when times get tough. I'm reminded of so many instances in human history when things have happened that have been really catastrophic for certain communities. whether it be a weather phenomena or some other natural disaster, economic disaster, and people rally together to try to, help one another. And that we always look at those as examples of kind of the best of humanity. And I think what we kind of forget there is it's not that we're all in agreement on what life is or what's important or whatever. It's that we're all actually trying to help one another, but we're also leaving room for each other to kind of be who we are. And to me, like, that's incredibly important. I'm okay with that. I'm comfortable with that in the community of ufology. There are these different expressions that tend to kind of work themselves out. And, it's my choice, particularly in social media, to either engage or disengage in the way that I feel, I'm called to do. And that in some ways may be, I just don't, I block or mute or whatever. I try not to block too much, honestly. Or I just, surround myself with folks that I think have are approaching this topic from a similar kind of energy, or at least are willing to have a conversation that is, fairly level-headed and not prone to kind of like flying off the handle. But even then, I've got friends that in the community that have opinions that I don't share, and that do kind of let off steam here and there, and that's okay. People are going to do what people do, and we have to kind of, I think, leave room for that behavior because it's just the way we are.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's a really important point to say that, first and foremost, we should remember that these are all human beings we're dealing with. And, I've heard even some people make this point when it comes to political profiling, right? Someone will say, well, this person tends to be associated with these things and they'll vote this way. And especially in a country like ours, which is very divided politically. But what people often don't remember to say is that, but at the end of the day, those are both human beings, right? And there's a story and an experience set behind why they are the way they are. And some of that they have almost or very little control over, where they're born, which state they're born in, what political persuasion they were raised with. For people like you and I who have this religious history, to what degree were you subjected to the notions of a fundamentalist religious system or not? All of these impact people, and a lot of this happens before people even have a say on whether or not they want to be subjected to that kind of thing. So yeah, it brings to mind another point that you and I have thought a lot about, and that is that in a post-church society, and I know that in America that's hard for some people to imagine we're moving towards that, especially in light of recent developments. But globally, there's definitely a move towards this post-church society. You definitely notice it in Western Europe, particularly, where, and Rupert Sheldrake's talked about this, we've lost something when we no longer gather together with our neighbors, right? I don't know about, well, I know for you've been asked to be a part of an HOA, but for me, I generally don't see my neighbors very much, and I might pass them when I'm walking on the trail and wave. But other than that, we don't get to know each other very much. And that's not the way things used to be. Things used to be, set up in such a way that you would get to know your neighbors, even the ones you didn't particularly like, or the ones that had annoying mannerisms. But what you inevitably did by being forced to interact with them was see them as multidimensional people that have some good things and some not good things. And sometimes these people that you might not align with are the ones that would come to your aid when you really need it, right? Versus other people who you may be aligned with conceptually left you out to dry, right? So again, this just pinpoints again this point that we're complex beings. And on social media, one of the real challenges of the internet in general, that even founders of major corporations like Twitter have pointed out with some regret, is how in some ways it's enabled some of the worst of humanity, where we can say horrible things about other people in comment sections, for instance. And because we know we will never see those people in person and never have to be held to account for what we've said, because we're often using a handle like ExoAcademian, which is not your name, and so you're not even held to account, or you can say the most horrific things, just sort of venting some deep darkness you have, and it in a moment makes you feel good about this power of like you just like launch something into the universe, but you're not ever confronted with the impact of that on another human being, at least until you get your past life or your lifetime review at the end of your life. You're going all that's going to come back to you. Everything you said in the comment section is going to come back to you. I'll point that out to people.
Oh, oh dear.
But you know, this is important to remember: is that there is a human being on the other side of that, and they've been through difficult things, and life is difficult for most people. Most people have challenges that we're not even aware of, and when we reduce them to a set of ideas they're putting forth about the phenomenon, we really do a disservice to trying to act as a community of human beings more than anything else.
Yeah, well said. Well, let's pivot away from the drama, and I know we're going to kind of touch on community again in a little bit, but let's pivot to something that Christopher Mellon said very recently. I think in Barcelona during an interview, and I'll paraphrase it here, but he sort of essentially said that government disclosure is not imminent. And I think that's kind of caught a lot of folks a little bit off guard, coming from someone who's been such a staunch proponent, of course, a former government insider. And there's been a lot of thought that, we really were close to some more significant revelations. And, I think it calls into question a lot of topics that we can get into, so one, I guess, how do you feel about that quote? But two, if the government's not going to step forward and kind of talk about disclosure, at least in a meaningful way, and if they're not going to do it, then who is? Where do we think that may come from? What do you think about this?
Yeah, it's interesting, and I think I saw a lot of people surprised by that comment because when you compare that to this level of enthusiasm we've been hearing from some people that people would consider insiders, right? People who have at least been part of the government structure, who have been surprisingly positive and enthusiastic about how much is shifting. So again, I think we need a nuanced perspective here. So on the one hand, like you pointed out at the beginning of the show, we've had congressional hearings, we've had language now put forth to protect whistleblowers in the future, and all signs are pointing towards fairly imminently there will be people who have awareness of legacy UFO programs that will be testifying before Congress. I'll also point out to people that those are going to be closed hearings because it's going to involve classified information. So we will not be seeing that publicly, but it will be happening behind closed doors and opening the eyes and ears of Congress people to how much has been going on. We've also had, items like the Wilson Davis notes added to the congressional record. These are all massive, massive moves. The videos that were released around 2017 and the New York Times articles, again, that's a massive shift from what used to be the case in Project Blue Book kind of days. So let's first step back and remember the last 5 years have been a whirlwind, but a lot has happened that, for people who've been in this for decades, there's no doubt there's been this sea change. But I think partly what Chris is trying to remember or remind us to do is to keep feet to the fire, that don't back off. It's because there's been pressure brought to bear against some of these deeply embedded secret structures that things are beginning to crack. Now is not the time to back off of that. We need to keep doing that. And I would also add that some of the people who have been in those former government positions or still aligned with the government in various ways, maybe as contractors and whatnot. Again, government is a complex assortment of a lot of different organizations. One hand often not talking to the 75 other hands, right? And we still have an issue with siloed information. We still have an issue where these various agencies have classification systems that prevent one group from talking to another group, or even being aware that one group exists within one classification structure. So that is still going to be a tough nut to crack. We almost need systemic change for that to happen. That even some of these insiders are finding it difficult to still get access to data. I know that's the case. That still getting access to data is a problem, even in this day and age. You're still seeing the Air Force, for instance, being pretty dismissive and doing everything it can to sort of evade even talking about this topic. That they probably more than anyone else have mountains of data that if we could analyze it, which again speaks to the AI thing, which we can touch base on, then we could really identify patterns that would be very meaningful. So I think all of that matters. That these secret structures aren't the ones that are saying, let's come forward. It's time, I mean, there are some people, no doubt, in there, but most of the cracking that's happening in the system is because of pressures being brought to bear from outside the system. So that's partly what he's saying, is we need to keep that up. I would also finally add, before I pass it back to you, because this is a complex topic, you know, there was a point where our classification systems and our tendency towards always classifying information made some sense. In the midst of a Cold War, for instance, where there was even strong evidence that there were Soviet agents that had infiltrated the CIA, for instance, right? In the midst of the Cold War, you can understand why it was considered at the time important to have a need to know, and put that into effect to the nth degree, where even within one agency, someone who works for that agency might not even know that a certain group exists, or you might have people that are running or involved in two operations at the same time. So every time they're at a certain location, you can say, oh yeah, they were just involved in Project A, while simultaneously Project B was also going on. So even when you try to uncover it in the historical record, and I know some of this has happened, you will have people who are involved with A and B, but because they always could explain it away as say, oh yeah, I was in Albuquerque because I was involved in Project A. And you could look up the documentation and you would find it in the historical record, which makes it look like nothing was going on. But the truth is, it was also Project B happening simultaneously. So that just gives you an idea of the degree to which these government structures have gone to hiding even the evidence of certain task force and whatnot even being in existence, even from people in their own agency. That had a point at some point. During the Cold War, that made some sense. But what happens is eventually these initial ideas, which are just loose ideas, right, become, again, they become monumentized within the system, right? So it becomes the default to always classify, right? To always classify and to reduce it to the fewest number of people who have a need to know as possible. And then what you end up with is a history where we have mountains of data that would tell us so much about the phenomenon. And I think, towards my working hypothesis, that there's numerous groups with different origin sources, we could have invaluable data that would demonstrate those different patterns, but it's all siloed away. So this is why we've got such a difficult process ahead of us. We really need a systemic change, a sea change within the entire organizational structure of the government for this to happen, even for people who have clearances and are working diligently towards this. It's still a massive obstacle they're running up against, is this siloing of information and the hyperclassification, which is handcuffing our society more than it's actually helping at this point.
Yeah, and if I could kind of summarize some of that too with an analogy, I think of it like an organism. So just like the human body, right? So think of the government as, a human body, and there are things happening inside the body all the time that our executive function, our conscious awareness, it's just we're not even cognizant of those things. Particularly when we're talking about things that might be like a disease or a parasite or a cancer or whatever. There could be something happening inside the body that we just have no, executive level awareness of. And oftentimes, that to an external observer, you can be looking at that individual and you can see signs of this issue. They might be subtle, but if you're trained, you might be able to catch them. That's what, hopefully what physicians are good at doing. They can look at an individual, they can look at, kind of blood panels and all these kinds of things and say, hey, this is an indication to me that there's something else happening here that you, the individual, are not aware of. And that's that's a lot how I think about the government, capital G government here, and this point from Chris Mellon when it comes to disclosure. you know an official statement from the government is akin to the individual in this example acknowledging that they have a disease, that they have some sort of issue that they weren't aware of. And so the physician, who is trained, who can see that thing, who can conduct the biopsy or whatever it is, they're the ones that are able to, kind of bring the individual awareness to focus on that. And then you can start creating a care plan, and you can acknowledge that it's real, and you can move forward. So that's really what I see happening here, kind of just generally, is that it's going to take time. It takes time to kind of diagnose the issue, to find out where the problem happens to be, to draw attention to that from the executive level, to understand what that is, and then to kind of formulate all of that into a comprehensive understanding that can be articulated. I have X, Y, Z, and I am doing X, to try to solve this. So I think, at least for me, that's a helpful analogy to think about what might be going on here. And I think too, it's a good reminder that this process is not going to be, and I've said this many, many times, I know we have on the show as well, this is not going to be something where it's just like a light switch, where we just kind of flip this and all of a sudden, boom, we have all of the answers, and, all of our questions are resolved. It's just, that is not the way it will occur. It's going to happen in incremental ways over time, and it's going to be, and I hope it is going to be, I think it will be, a collective process. That there is a part, in other words, that the government plays in disclosure. There's also a part that society plays in disclosure. Obviously, government is given power from its people, and so there is this kind of dialectic conversation happening with these individuals and the organizations to kind of move us into what official disclosure looks like. And by the way, that process is actually never really done. There will always be mysteries that have yet to be disclosed, and that I think that's something people need to get comfortable with. There's not going to be this sort of grand revelatory moment when all questions in the universe have been addressed. We need to be, I think, thinking about that and preparing ourselves for that, because a lot of folks, in my opinion at least, seem to have really kind of crazy expectations about what is going to happen here, that it's going to, like, all of our problems are going to be solved and everything's going to be great when we get that disclosure. But I know we were talking about this topic too, and you wanted to touch on some of the things that might be different about kind of where we are today versus where we've been in history. Because, with ufology, at least in the last, 7+ decades, we've been through cycles like this before, where we've kind of been on the precipice of, greater revelation, and the door has been shut again. But, is there something different about today that really gives you a lot more hope than kind of where we've been?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad we're going to address this because I think this is flying under the radar for a lot of people. Now, on the one hand, I can see how people are cynical, and frustrated, and they say, look, it's been 75 years already. And you just admitted, Darren, that, the secret keepers still don't want to release the secrets. So how do we know it's not just going to be more of the same ultimately, that these hopes end up being false hopes? And I would say there's numerous things that are different. One really distinct difference has to do with the tools the deep state can bring to bear to keep this secret, right? So in the 1950s or 60s, pre-internet, long before the internet, there was, efforts to, for instance, control journalists and control news media, right? And so you would sometimes have articles that were simultaneously released around the world, published around the world, that contained almost the exact same kind of structure of language, right? Now, back in those days, somebody in Milan, Italy, is not going to be reading the New York Times likely, They're not going to be reading, the Los Angeles Times. They're not going to be reading the Boise Post or whatever newspaper they have in Boise, or the Toronto Star or whatever. I mean, the point being that it was much easier to control the dissemination of information in those days because you could have this worldwide effort to funnel disinformation through journalists. And no one would pick up on the fact that this coordinated effort was happening globally to, for instance, suppress interest in UFOs and suppress the belief that they're real, right? But number one, not only can that not happen now because you and I can get on the internet and pull up all of those newspapers, right? But we also now have really powerful software that can scan thousands and thousands of newspapers around the world and recognize when that happens. When there's a coordinated disinformation campaign, it'll recognize and it'll be plain as day, right? But very, very importantly, that also now applies to the historical record. So all of those efforts that were made in the 20th century to suppress information and to deflect from important data that was already leaked out into the public can now be found, scanned, collated, and can generate really valuable intel. And that is happening as we speak. There are people who are employing really sophisticated AI to scan everything under the sun, including documents that have been locked up in private libraries and places like that for decades, right? And this is where, by the way, legacy ufologists who've been at this for years, holding on to your private collection of data is not helpful at this point. Everybody needs to be on the same team, put that information forward so we can run this data analysis and notice these trends, not just about what governments have done to suppress information, but we can also corroborate different parts of the narrative too and say, well, we know this person was involved because over here we have their military record. I know some people who are even employing getting on to ancestry.com and actually finding out, sure enough, this person was related to this person, and what I'm trying to point out is that it's amazing, startling, game-changing how much we can actually reconstruct the true narrative of the 20th century in opposition to what we were actually told about the history of the 20th century. And this is happening as we speak. And there's very little the secret keepers can do to stop it because that information is already out there. It just, to use a Jeremy Corbell phrase, it wasn't weaponized before, right? It was there, but it wasn't useful because it was just sitting there. So while it's true that we still have problems with siloing of information within the government structure, nevertheless, in the public record around the world, there's so much information we do have access to. And at this point, it's just a matter of running that analysis and finding those patterns and beginning to expose the entire thing. And I will just warn people, some people will be daunted by this. Other people will feel enthused about it, that it will ultimately reconstruct a very, very different narrative about the entire 20th century than we've been told up until now. So just prepare yourself because that is coming.
Yeah, I'm glad you pointed that out. And it feels as if we are at a time where at least more folks are, I think, opening up to that possibility that there seems to be at least enough incidents in U.S. history that we can look to where we can just very clearly see there was a coordinated effort to, kind of convince the public and the world that events transpired like this and not like that. I mean, this is something that isn't new. We've talked about this many times, and I think most people who've done any degree of study on any topic understand that those that have the power of the pen are those that possess the power of the truth, and truth in quotes there. And so this isn't a new concept, but it is amazing what we can do now with this technology to, I think, unravel some of the official narratives and present more information and different perspectives on what actually took place. And as you point out, like, it can be incredibly destabilizing. And this is something that I have always, kind of wondered about, in particular with the topic of disclosure, is in the world in which we live now, where we are wrestling with kind of a consensus narrative of what's going on. We have everyone kind of with their own sort of bubble of truth. You know, how is it going to be? How will this sort of reality kind of seep into our understanding to where, and how long will it take? So it's not going to be as simple as in the past where there's just some sort of great headline from insert your news station of choice or paper of choice, and the world's just saying, yep, that's what happened. We don't live in that kind of world any longer. So even if we get some of the information that we are hoping for, and if that's disseminated by, again, insert your sort of venue of choice, we have to remember that there's still going to be some contention as to what is actually happening. There's always going to be some narrative control, and so we are living in a world now where we're struggling with this. I don't see that changing. What I do hope is that perhaps with tools like AI, we will kind of maybe get to a consensus picture a little bit faster. But even then, I don't know. It's going to be a real challenge, and I think that it's a good reminder for all of us that we need to, have some degree of mental flexibility. We need to be able to kind of roll with whatever might come our way and leave an open mind because, to some degree, there's a little bit of truth and a little bit of falsehood in just about everything that we experience in our collective life today.
Yeah, absolutely true. Um, it also occurs to me that just to further the point that we've both been making, one of the techniques that has been employed historically is to say if there's this sense that the government, and I say that in quotes again because this is a complex picture of a lot of different organizations made up of a cross section of our society. So all sorts of different worldviews existing, different personal agendas even within that. So people need to keep that in mind. It does no good to set up the government as a boogeyman, right? Or a straw man. So, but when you think back to like you say, there's some events that get reconstructed, like Watergate or the Pentagon Papers when that came out, where people go, okay, so we understand what happened now, right? We have data that says this happened, A happened rather than B, right? And certain secret structures try to convince us of B when really it was A. That works partly because you're still within the same overarching truth structure, right? The challenge with the UFO phenomenon, and this is sort of building on what you were hinting at there, is that even when you have data, you still need analysis, which involves inevitably interpretation, right? And part of the challenge we're facing now is you have certain groups like the Collins elite, for instance, within government structures that have a particular interpretive perspective, right? And the challenge is, how do we let that information in its raw form get out to the public rather than just get its interpreted representation out to the public? Um, I see a lot of people still, in my mind, making the mistake of thinking, look, these are people with high security clearances, with good educations. Surely they're not going to be biased by a worldview perspective, such as religious history or a religious perspective. So we can trust what they're telling us. If they're saying it's demons, it's got to be, right? And I've made this point many times, and I would just say, those people are your neighbors, meaning they're a cross section of our society with different worldviews, and we cannot trust that. We need to have the information in its raw format. I do not want someone who's an insider saying, all I got to tell you is it's great news, or it's bad news, or it's sobering, or it's it's challenging, or it's fascinating. Those are all interpretive words, and it doesn't help me understand what's actually in the data. And what's different about this process, and you and I have talked about this privately, that even the people that are working towards, again, applying pressure to crack this nut open, the overarching and daunting question is what happens when it does finally crack? When that data comes out, you're going to have all these different worldviews interpreting now based on their own perspectives, many of them not being aware that they have a biased perspective, as we all do at any point. And so you're going to then have some pressures in the world because you're going to have different interpretations of what this means, which is going to be challenging on its own. And I don't know that there's any easy answer to that. Like you pointed out, we're always in a process of evolving our understanding of what reality itself is. But that said, there are certain points where there's more consensus agreement than others. And just even aside of the UFO phenomenon, in our American culture, we're really seeing almost two distinct worldviews play out, right? And that just gives you a hint of what's going to happen when this emerges and emerges on the global stage, right? So you've got all these different nation states with different worldview perspectives within those different historical traditions that are going to take that information and put it through its own kind of filter. It's going to be a complex situation. I don't think any of us know what it's going to produce ultimately. And there are so many directions it could go from here that it's literally almost impossible to accurately predict, even if you pull in sociologists and psychologists and different, leaders of different groups like the Catholic Church and Buddhists or whatever to try and give their input. This is one of those things where there's so many variables in play that it's very difficult to know where this is going to go in the long run, and to what degree, of course, is the phenomenon itself going to play a role? To what degree will the phenomenon try to input, various bits of information or maybe even narrative assistance to facilitate that? But it's going to be a civilization changing event no matter what happens.
Yeah, completely agree. And this is where, for me, I'm going to emphasize. I'm going to put on kind of an old hat that I wore in the past, the sort of the pastoral hat or the counselor hat in a previous life, and that is that regardless of what facts emerge, it doesn't change the fact that we as individuals, have things that we can do in how we comport ourselves and take care of ourselves, and how we interact with one another in community. So these grand revelations, whatever they are, they don't absolve us of responsibility to have and develop, greater self-awareness, to think about the way that we not only treat ourselves but treat one another. To me, these are the biggest issues outside of the technicalities. And for that reason, I often kind of say that UFOs and the paranormal and all of the things that constitute the phenomena, you know, they're amazing things, and they're fun to talk about. I think they certainly sort of light my curiosity on fire, but they don't change some of the fundamental things that we as human beings have to deal with. So this, I think, kind of is maybe a good segue to talking about the buzzword that we've been hearing a lot recently, at least in our circles, and that's this notion of community, and what it means to kind of be in community with one another. What is a community? Do we have one in ufology? Is there one sort of collection of folks that we can point to and say, here we are kind of doing community together? And I think there are many ways to think about that issue. And first of all, I think it's incredibly important. Everyone needs a community. Everyone, quite frankly, has a community already, and we navigate through several of them in our day-to-day life. I went to the grocery store this morning. For a brief period of time, I was part of a community of individuals that were at that store. So we kind of traffic in and out of different groups of people all the time, but we have other certain groups that we place a high degree of primacy and importance on, things like our family, maybe our neighborhood. If you're religious, it could be, your religious institution or house of worship or whatever. It could be an interest group that you have. I've got a long-standing community of friends that I like to play video games with. So there are lots of different ways that human beings kind of organize ourselves into community. But what, as you've thought about this a lot, I know, what are some good ways that we can look at the community of individuals that find this topic in particular interesting? And, how do we have a healthy conversation, a healthy understanding of what that looks like? And where do you see the community kind of moving as we continue to make progress in various fronts with this issue in particular?
Yeah, the community catchword has definitely been emerging a lot. I know that we're both, based on our history, really interested in this, and we are pro community, right? We recognize that we've lost something to some degree in our society, because what the internet has enabled, amongst the many things that are so great about it, right? We have access to more information than, you know, 10,000 Library of Alexandrias, right? At any moment, you need to fix something in your house or change your oil in your motorbike. If you're me, you can just look up a YouTube video, right? But what it's also done is it's created these echo chambers, right? So rather than getting to know your neighbors who may have different worldviews, which in an ideal situation helps expand your own worldview, right? That there's a reason why you have more progressive, diverse cultures or more progressive cultures along the coasts of, for instance, our country. And a lot of it comes down to you have more immigrants in those areas because they're, access to the oceans, which exposes people to new ideas, which tends to expand their worldview. In the same way, when we used to gather together with our neighbors, we were exposed to people that maybe don't think exactly like we do or have personality traits that are different than what we maybe favor. And that was to our benefit. The challenge with the internet is you can find people that have the very same personality as you, believe the exact same things about the world as you, believe the exact same things about everything that's wrong with everybody else. And you get this echo chamber that's self reinforcing, right? And so you end up with this demonization of everyone who doesn't fit that. And even if you're in the minority, you can find enough people because you can pull from a global pool that fit that, which does not serve us all very well. And we're really, speaking of culture and change and evolution, we're really in the midst of trying to figure out what that looks like. Is it up to the social media companies to police that? To try and say our fact checkers have checked and that's not true, or this is true. Sometimes that'll work in our favor and sometimes it won't, right? For instance, there's a lot of bias against the UFO phenomenon. Even today, you still see a lot of suppression in search engine rankings and whatnot of these kind of topics, right? And you'll get like skeptical Wikipedia articles that show up first. But all that said, I also think, and we've talked about this privately, that some people sometimes apply that term community too loosely, right? They'll say, well, the UFO Twitter community is really suffering this week, right? And what we sometimes are not self-aware about is the fact that we all have different curated, lists of people that are part of our particular version of UFO Twitter. So, for instance, I curate mine in such a way that I tend to avoid a lot of the drama and only sort of hear about it when people repost other people's comments about it. So that's the first thing to point out, is that it's actually more nuance about what UFO Twitter actually is than we sometimes acknowledge. Another piece I would add is that, and we also talked about this before we went on the air, that there are some people who have the most global view on community, right, the UFO community, who think that we're still wrestling with questions around, is this real at all, right? Is this really happening, or is it just all a combination of misidentifications of military flights and weather phenomena and delusional people, right? There's still some people asking and wanting to answer that question. And so, for instance, I'm going to be involved in speaking at an event in New York, which is specifically already sort of kind of moved past that question. It's more geared towards people who are experiencers or who are interested in the experience of experiencers. and what these anomalous experiences say about reality, and how we can live lives when these kind of events are happening. But this week, there's a couple of people who said, "Oh, is there a reason why no skeptics are invited to this event?" And again, I think from their perspective, they're saying, "Oh, because every UFO conference should be asking these base questions rather than acknowledging, no, there are different subgroups within UFO Twitter, even, right? And it's okay to acknowledge that different people will get together. If you want to have a skeptics group, you can, and I say go for it. Like I'm not saying let's say some questions can't be asked anymore. If that's where you're at, then go to it. More power to you. Keep asking that question as you can, but don't try to suppress those who feel like there is abundant evidence that they're already on to the second level of questions.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it reminds me of those who sort of made it their mission to kind of go after groups that they disagree with. So if you've ever been, I mean, a good example of this is there are certain atheists who spend a lot of their energy and time really working hard to try to dismantle the things that they find wrong about organized religion or religious belief generally. So every kind of waking moment, they're kind of putting together arguments and engaging with those communities to with the hope of convincing them that their religious beliefs are wrong. um, and you certainly can do that, and we talked about energy earlier, and there are some individuals where that's just a need that they have, to kind of to work that out, and to engage with people in that way, and that becomes their identity. um, no amount of thoughtful conversation or talk or whatever is going to change the fact that people are going to do that, right? So it's just the way that things are. But even still, it's okay for folks to organize around things that they feel a conviction on. They can. I mean, we do this all the time. We have friends that we like because we share common interests, and we don't think of our friend groups as who love going to do whatever it is together. Whether play a sport or watch a sport, or engage in music or whatever it is that we like doing together. We don't think of those people as engaged in some sort of a cult of football. We could call it that, but I think using the word cult, for the most part in our culture, it's kind of used in a pejorative sense. If we're using that term, we often are, trying to put someone else down. We're trying to in-group and out-group individuals with the intention of painting them in a negative light. The reality is we all have our interest groups. We all like, congregating around people that we enjoy being with. And that often is people that we find ourselves in agreement with. I do think that healthy communities are going to make space for, and in some ways even kind of ritualize uh, the role of the skeptic or of the challenging question or the disbeliever or whatever it may be. At least the healthy communities that I've been a part of don't seem to shy away from that. They certainly wrestle with it. I mean, I've been a part of many kind of organizations that have had those voices, and you can kind of leave the group discussion going, well, here we go again, we're going to talk about this, and it's just kind of exhausting. But at the same time, I think if you're really genuinely invested in the individuals and you're engaging in good faith, it really shouldn't bother you, because it's either going to strengthen your beliefs and your conviction, or it's not. And either way is okay. We all have our own kind of journeys to take here.
Yeah, it's a complex situation, because we're saying on the one hand that we all want to acknowledge the humanity in each other, right? That in the biggest community picture, we are all human beings, and we have numerous factors that have influenced who we are and why we adopt any particular worldview, why we're a cynic or a skeptic or not, right? Um, You look at someone like a Mick West, and there are some people who really look back on all of the damage that was done when we used to burn witches, right? When the church had power, and how that was not based on reason and rationality. And so someone like a Mick West or people like him look at, with maybe not the most accurate lens, though they kind of associate those who are enthusiastic about UFOs potentially representing alien visitation in that same sort of light. They sort of see it as that more of that irrational, unreasonable, ungrounded in facts perspectives that ultimately can do a lot of damage. And I think we need to acknowledge that, right? That there can be good reasons why people have adopted that skeptical approach. It's not just that they're all mean people, or they just like to be Debbie Downers, right? Like some people really believe that, in their heart of hearts, they believe that to let people believe these kind of fantastical things ultimately does harm to the civilization, like even violent harm based on our history. And they're absolutely right. That has happened. But sometimes we can overreact, right? I've talked many times on this program about how we have these pendulum swings, right? Even as an entire culture. So coming out of the church having the rule, once that kind of impact and that rule diminished, you had people within the scientific community saying, now, wait a second. That whole thing was not only hogwash, but it did incredible damage to our civilization. So we're going to do everything we can to stamp out every last ember of it, right? Like you brought up the point how some atheists kind of have that as their ongoing mission. I remember hearing someone who was like the president of a certain psychological association say that our role as psychologists and psychiatrists should be to stamp out religion, like stamp out religious belief, which is a strange mission for the president of a psychological association to take. It seems to me that you should just go where the data leads you, and not begin with a mission a priori that's based on a pre-existing position. But this is the challenge, and there's not simple answers. But we need to, regardless, move forward, regardless of what community we are a part of, remembering that in the larger sense, we are, part of the human community. And I would even argue, this intergalactic community of sentient agents that all have more in common than we don't. And we sometimes do a disservice to who we really are when we forget that.
Yeah, well said. Well, as we kind of wind down the episode, what are some things that are kind of top of mind for you as we look ahead, not only with our show, Liminal Frames, but Point of Convergence, and then outside of the kind of the shows, what are some things coming up on the horizon? I know you mentioned the symposium in New York. Very excited about that. Hopefully, folks can either attend in person or you can attend that digitally. It'll be an excellent series of conversations. But what are some things that you see happening on the horizon?
Yeah, on that one point there with the symposium, what's so exciting about that is that it's a living, breathing example of what we've been talking about, like getting together with people in 3D, breaking bread with people literally, and getting to know people in more of a full picture of who they really are, right? I think that's essential, and that unlike UFO Twitter, you can't completely curate who's on that list and who's not, right? So that means you're going to end up, interacting with people who maybe don't have the same perspective as you, even though some, critics would say, well, you're limiting who's going to be there based on the nature of the discussion points. Fair enough. That's true to some degree. A Mick West probably is not going to want to attend that conference. But Mick, you're welcome if you want to. But nevertheless, even within that, you're going to run into people who maybe have challenging personalities from your point of view, or see certain things differently than you do, or have certain aspects of themselves that they're not self-aware about that seem more glaring to you. But that's all good. I mean, I think that it makes us more gracious towards our fellow human beings when we do interact, because again, we're reminded more of what we have in common rather than what makes us different. Another thing I would say in terms of what I'm looking forward to is And this touches on something you asked about earlier, which is, if it's not through government disclosure, what is going to crack this nut? I would just say that I would point people to how certain topics tend to go viral in our current society. As much as it was a great event historically when the New York Times published those articles, from Ralph Blumenthal and Leslie Kean in 2017, actually, sometimes not only is government, but even newspapers and journalists these days are actually responsive to these groundswell movements that can form, right? That don't originate there, but end up being talked about there. And there are certain people, for instance, in our society that have a lot of influence, right, on social media. Now, I will say this: if you can get some of those people to see the evidence that don't have the biases that, say, that the scientific mainstream has or the government system has, then you could suddenly overnight ignite a fire that would end up inevitably impacting those newspapers and those government systems, because some of those people have so much influence. So this is a way we could take, the internet for all its flaws and benefits, and really use it towards good ends here, really productive ends. That if you can persuade some of those people that don't have these biases and aren't part of these and aren't beholden to these systems like mainstream science and the academic game, right, which has all of these structures in place that make it difficult to even ask certain questions. Some of these people are outside of those structures, and if one or two of those people can get a hold of this and be lit by it, right? Be really taken with, wait a second, this is the biggest question. This should be front page news in the New York Times. Some of these people getting involved could be the very historical event that makes this a front page story of the New York Times.
I love that. Yeah, we can go after the influencers and kind of see what might happen there. Yeah, and for me, just personally, I over the last several months, my energy has been really kind of tried to direct it toward more personal engagement, and so that can be trying to deepen relationship that I have in a virtual sense with people that I've encountered on my journey here, getting to know them in a better way, a deeper way, knowing more of who they are as a person outside of just their beliefs or behaviors within, the Twitter community or the UFO community. And I'm looking for ways to continue to do that ahead. I think that there's a tremendous amount of value to having a deeper engagement with individuals, particularly when it comes to this topic. And I don't mean that just in the sense of, it's great to know people and develop closer friendships, but I really think of it from the standpoint of there is something fundamentally valuable about developing relationships with people generally. That there's something special, and I think we've all experienced this, at least I hope we all have experienced this at some point in our lives, whether it be through family or a friendship or a partnership, where we we have this sort of difficult to quantify feeling and sense of importance in human relationship, and there's a lot of power there when we can find that and nurture that. And I would encourage people to look for ways that they can do that. Just broadly, it doesn't have to be with the UFO community. It can be any community that you are involved in. Kind of lean into those relationships. Try to be a little bit more authentic and more personable and vulnerable, at least in ways that are appropriate for you. Because I'm of the opinion that when we can do that, we can find opportunity to do that. We really, improve the overall quality of our individual lives, our collective lives, and I think the life of our world. So we need more of that, not less. And we've kind of found ourselves in a time period in human history where we're a little bit unmoored. We haven't been doing that as well as we used to do it, and I think we need to kind of bring some of that back and look for ways. At least I'm looking for ways where I can do that in a more meaningful way.
Yeah, it's a great point, and I say here. And I would just add that there's even an energetic reason why that's important, and that is that like even to pull up something that is recorded as being uttered from the lips of Jesus, right? Where two or more are gathered, right? It's this notion that actually, was it Jesus? I forget who said it, but it's in the Bible anyway, in the New Testament. And the point being that there is some sort of energetic wavelength that gets kicked up to a much higher degree that's more than the sum of its parts when people gather around a shared vision. That is something I call we space, right? It's incredibly powerful. I've experienced it in numerous gatherings that I've been a part of, where you have, as much as, yes, it's true that we should also join together with people who maybe don't see the things, say things the same way we do. But nevertheless, when you do gather together with people in a heartfelt way, and you align on a shared purpose, right? That it seems like the universe joins hands with us in that process. And the energy resonance that's generated is much greater than the sum of its parts. And it's enough to begin to really change the structure of our civilization. So, and it changes certainly the people that are involved. So, yes, I completely agree. And I that's one of the trends I'm really excited about that's happened, even within UFO Twitter. You and I have been a part of different groups that have sort of split off and joined together around different topics and gotten to know each other in more multidimensional ways. There's so many positive benefits that come from that I would encourage more of that for everybody that's involved.
Absolutely. Well, we'll conclude on that. It's been a pleasure getting back to the Liminal Frames microphone, and we really want to thank everybody who has been with us on this journey, whether you've been with us from the start or just now picking up the show. We really want to say our thanks to you and look forward to continuing this conversation with you in the weeks and months ahead. As we conclude, may the quality of our questions, shaped by a desire for understanding, enhance our journey of discovery. And may our travels broaden the sphere of our consciousness, reminding us that new discoveries beget new horizons. As always, adventure awaits. We'll see you next time on Liminal Frames.